Welcome to the Haffenreffer Museum Gallery on the Brown campus. I'm Bill Simmons. I'm a faculty member in the Anthropology department. And when Brown's 250th anniversary came around, the university was asking for projects, from the different parts of the campus that would contribute to it. So I was thinking, well, what could the Haffenreffer Museum contribute? Well, we could show our archaeological artifacts. We could do that. But my field is anthropology, religion, symbolism, mythology, and things of that sort. So I thought, universities are about as symbolic and traditional and in many ways religious as any institution on the planet. And they have all kinds of relics and processions and rituals that they go through and so forth. So anyway, this is it. This is our exhibit. And I'll say that most of the objects in this room have never been together before. They're sequestered in special collections and locked drawers in University Hall and various moth-proof closets and so forth. And they're only brought out for traditional sort of ritualistic celebrations like we have here today, which means that some of the artifacts on display here can't be shown to you because they're going to be worn by the president and the chancellor and the mace carrier of part of the activities for today and tomorrow. So for these 2 days, unfortunately, the exhibition is a little bit incomplete. So what I want to first do is say a few words about the symbols of Brown. And Brown is not at all unusual in having this repertoire of symbols. If you look at Harvard, Yale, Penn, Berkeley, Stanford, any university across the country, they basically all have symbols, and these symbols are usually all of the same kind. But where the universities stand apart are what are the particular symbols and what are the particular history of the institution and so forth. So what I'm going to do is to say a few words about Brown's symbols, and then I'm going to say a few words about Brown's rituals, so when you see what happened today and tomorrow, procession and so forth, you have a better sense of what's going on. But Brown originated in 1764, and that date is when the charter was signed by the colony of Rhode Island and by the various people who are proposing themselves to be the trustees in the corporation of Brown University. And that charter, I guess you could say in a sense, was Brown's first symbol because it defined the purpose of the institution, it defined the governance of the institution, and it was validated by the highest authorities to which the colonies recognized, which were the King and Queen of England, George III and his wife Charlotte, the King's representative as the governor of Rhode Island, and then various other notable merchants and other important people in Rhode Island back in that day. So in a sense, the charter is Brown's sacred document. It's where everything begins, and it's where the legitimacy of the institution begins. So it defines what the purposes are of the institution, what its relationship should be to the colony, what it is that in a general sense it should be teaching, how it should be organized, who's in charge of what decisions, and also what privileges that the university would have as an institution within society. And the idea of privilege is really interesting because medieval universities always considered themselves from the beginning to be not only places in the world where they were teaching people about how to better the world and so forth, but they were also places apart from the world. And so what the charter provides are the privileges, some of the privileges that define the way in which the university is apart from the world. And one of those was that they don't have to pay any taxes. Another is that the students don't have to perform menial service or military service or get involved in colonial militias and so on. So from the very beginning, the property was tax exempt, working here was tax exempt, and there are other ways in which the university community itself was separated from the outside world. It was like a sovereignty of its own. In that charter, it specified that the university should have a seal. And this is also every university has a seal. The seal is the imprimatur of the corporation. That is the governing body of the university, governing body of the institution. And the seal was to be designed and carved by the campus, by the corporation itself. Brown was to design its own seal. and that this would then be used to stamp diplomas, and it would be used to validate any kind of economic transactions, business transactions. It was the imprimatur, the symbol of the institution. So Brown's first seal, of course, was honoring the King and Queen of England. It's King George III and his wife Charlotte. And if you walk down to the Sharp Refectory, which is called the Ratty today, you'll see that above the doors of the Ratty, there are a number of different emblems out there, just sort of look decorative emblems. But one of them to the right, as you go down Bristol Quadrangle towards the Ratty to the right, is the Brown seal, replication of the Brown seal of King George and Queen Charlotte, the original seal. They became kind of like out of date following the American Revolution, and so following that, Brown created a new seal which was consistent with the Enlightenment. The idea now that knowledge was really growing, and technology and all the things that were sort of leading to the modern disciplines were sort of people begin to understand the great potential and a future in terms of scientific discovery and so forth. So Brown's second seal was a temple, and it says in Latin, I forget how the Latin was, but it says in translation of the Latin is that it's a temple sacred to knowledge. And then underneath that, it says something to the effect, it's a temple sacred to knowledge and open to all. And then beneath that, also in Latin, it said something to the effect of that this is a place to cultivate virtue. So these were the values then of the Enlightenment, and that's what was on the second Brown seal, as Brown became no longer a colony, but now an independent part of the newly formed United States. In 1804, John Nicholas Brown Jr. Gave a gift to the university, and they needed some support to continue their sort of building program and book buying and the rest of it. So John Nicholas Brown Jr. gave a significant gift at the time, and that led to the renaming of Brown. That was in 1804. But for some strange reason, people forgot to rename it. I mean, they named it, but they forgot to change the seal. So up until 1834, the old seal of the Temple of Knowledge, but it was President Manning who realized, no, we changed our name to Brown. This is no longer the College of Rhode Island, and so we're going to change it. So 1834, they changed the Temple of Learning seal to the current one, which is St. George's Cross on a white shield, and then above that is the rising sun, and then within the arms of the St. George's Cross are 4 books. And the question always arises, what are the 4 books? And no one really knows. Many college seals, both English and American, had books on them. Harvard had 3, for example, on their Veritas shield and so forth. The chaplain thinks that they're the first 4 books of the apostles, which may be correct. But in any event, the seal that was then designed in 1834 is the one that we have today. And unfortunately, the trustees who designed that seal didn't leave any explanation as to why they chose the symbols they did. I guess they felt that everybody knows what that is, and so they never bothered to specify what it was. And so I've tried to figure out exactly what these symbols might have meant to them. And the one of the rising sun is the most interesting. The St. George's Cross is not difficult. St. George's Cross was carried in the Crusades. The St. George's Cross was one of the symbols of the Commonwealth period, during the Cromwell reign of the Puritans in England, to which the Brown community felt itself in some sense connected. So that stood for Protestantism, and it stood for Christianity. But the sun was kind of interesting because, it's a very common symbol that occurs here and there. And so I came across 2 discoveries. One is that if you go through the North Burial Ground here and look at the stones, Chad Brown stone has that rising sun on it. And this piece of land here where Brown was built was Chad Brown's property. When Brown decided to establish itself and locate itself physically, the Brown family got together and they bought this 8 acres of land, And they wanted to make sure that it was on Brown family property, and Chad Brown was the first Baptist minister of Providence, or first Baptist elder of Providence, and also one of the original settlers of Providence. And they liked the idea not only that it was his property, but it was at the top of the hill. So the village of Providence was down here along the river, and Brown University was up there where you can look to the west to the horizon and you can look to the east to the horizon. So I think that it doesn't say exactly what that rising sun meant to the people who designed the seal, but it does suggest something in the local environment that might have given them the idea. And interestingly, once you notice the seal and think about it, you'll find that doorways all over Providence and many of the old houses in Rhode Island, in some sense, and I'm sure this is unconscious, replicate the Brown seal in the sense that the panels of the door are laid in a cross fashion as it is on the Brown shield. And then above the door, you'll see a kind of a hemispherical arch that goes across from one side to the next. And in those hemispherical arches is a lower face, or is a lower circle below. They usually don't have eyes and nose and mouth as the Brown seal does, but nevertheless they have the rays and the rest of it. So in the 18th century, when this seal was designed, it appeared both on gravestones and doors. So my thinking is that the university is a place where people, in some sense, and it was what they thought, it was a doorway in. It's a doorway into this new world of the university, and it's at the same time, with that symbol on the gravestone, it's also the doorway to heaven. So it's the front door and the back door, but both doors are identical. But nevertheless, so anyway, that's how I interpret it at this point. If it meant something to them, what they were doing with this seal is indicating this is a community apart from the world, and there's something sacred and special about it. And so this is coming into it, and as we do when we come in and when we leave St. Van Wickle Gate, I mean, we go through those same doorways. So the three seals of Brown are over here to be seen when you have a free moment, the original one and the one with the Temple of Learning representing the 7 liberal arts, and then the contemporary one, which is the Brown seal. Now derived from the 1834 seal is what we call the shield, or sometimes but anyway, the Brown logo, which is just basically the rising sun with the shield beneath it with the cross, but none of the Latin inscriptions. And that is because the Latin inscriptions are the property, the complete seal is the property of the corporation, and only they can use it. And they're the ones who determine what degrees it goes on and whatever else official papers it goes on. So that represents the complete authority of the institution. And anyone who uses that or replicates it in any sense of that complete image is in some way behaving illegally, and you can in fact be sued for that. But we have the logos on t-shirts and on hats and on doorways and on buildings and on stationery and so forth. So that's a kind of a derivation from the Brown seal. But it's also interesting in the sense that the 4 compartments of the shield have been kind of a place where people could do a little innovating. Since it's no longer the official seal and it can be modified in certain ways, the Native American student group, for example, as we'll see over here, has certain Native American images in those 4 corners of the shield. The Korean Students Association has other Korean images, and a Muslim Students Association has Muslim images. The Pre-Dental Society of Brown has its own logo with its own images and so forth. So we have replications of all of these over here. So the seal then is Brown's most sacred symbol. It represents the charter, it represents the origin of the place, it represents the governing statutes, and by and large, which are entirely those which are observed and respected today. Following that, other sort of symbols began to arise along the way. In the 19th century, particularly when intercollegiate athletics became important, the various colleges became more interested in distinguishing themselves from one another. That is, you had seals, but you can't use the seal exactly to distinguish you, and you don't want to put a seal on an athletic uniform. There's nothing really heroic about that exactly. It's more like medieval and arcane. And so this led to the world of animal mascots. They weren't all animals. I mean, some of them were Native Americans, and some were Quakers, and various other sort of categories that were in people's minds at the time, ways in which they tried to give their institution an identity. But Brown, like all of its contemporary colleges, Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, and so forth, all around this time, middle to the late 19th century, created these mascots for themselves. And so Brown has the bear, and apparently the bear goes back to Theodore Francis Green, who thought it was a good idea, since everyone else had mascots, that Brown have one. And he said he picked the bear because it was strong, because it emanated an image of power so that no one would mess with it or do anything to aggravate it, that it was a local species. Brown was a very local place back, and it was a local species, but most important, it was capable, he said, of being educated. So the idea of a Brown student back in those days, I guess, was some rough, unpolished sort of young male who had to learn Latin and geometry and, music and all these other things, and that the bear was like, the bear can learn. And so it's sort of his way of saying that this is what Brown is. It's a finishing school for people who need to be finished. So that's Brown's mascot. And Brown has, there was one big bronze bear in front of the old marble gymnasium, which has since been moved to the campus. You can see when you come through the Florence House Tunnel that there's a big statue of a bear over there, which is probably the most archetypical of the Brown mascot representations. 2 years ago, a Brown trustee, with the opening of the new athletic center, the swim center over there on Hope Street, decided that Brown needed a new bear, and so here we have the artist cast, or the artist mold, with that new bear in white there you can see. The actual bear himself, known as Indomitable, picking up from Theodore Francis Green, that bear is now the huge Brown statue that stands in front of the swim center on Hope Street there by the hockey rink and so forth. And they went the extra mile on designing this bear. They got the sculptor in the world who understood the meaning, the ways in which you recognize the emotions that a bear is communicating when a bear makes its grimaces and faces and so forth. And so someone said, and one of the ways in which the bear is frequently represented is with his mouth open, sort of growling out there, on football jerseys. But rather, the trustee decided that he wanted a more reserved, but nevertheless just as powerful, just as strong representation. And bears open their mouth when they're angry. And this is a bear that doesn't open its mouth, but is emanating such an image of power, such an expression of power, that you realize that you want to stay back. He's defending the campus and you want to stand back from it. So one of the things that happens then is that these mascots distinguish one school from another. They try to steal each other's mascot, or humiliate each other's mascot, and so on. But at the same time, the mascots to the campus itself represent something about they say, well, we think it represents something about the quality of the people that go there. Another symbol that came up in the 19th century is the Alma Mater. And the Alma Mater is a lot like the mascot in the sense that the mascot gives a sense of solidarity, it gives a sense of community to the student body, and the Alma Mater does that too. And the deans wrote about that in the early 20th century. President Faunce wrote about it. President Faunce wrote that it's unthinkable to have a university today without an Alma Mater. And the idea for that is that it not only through its words represents certain values of the institution, but through its music creates opportunities for joint participation in rituals and ceremonies, but also in a sense on occasions that bind people together as a community. One of the things the Alma Mater does is it binds people as a community, and it goes into the long-term memory, just as hymns and anthems and Gregorian chants and so forth out of religious heritage are a way in which a person carries their religious socialization with them. Your music goes through your mind as you think or as you walk or as you go through life, and the Alma Mater in some sense fulfills that purpose. It's something that goes into your long-term memory that binds you forever to the institution. Other symbols, more recent, they're equally old in terms of their pure historical origin, but more recent within Brown's history. The mace, and unfortunately the mace is out doing business this weekend. It's going to be carried in the procession tomorrow, so we can't see it. But maces were carried by the mayor of London, and they were carried by religious authorities, and they were carried by medieval authorities and knights and whatnot. So they're originally an implement of war, but they got into academic processions. And as American universities became wealthier, as they became more self-confident, more powerful, and more influential, after the turn of the 19th century, where science and the humanities and social sciences and so forth, where American universities began to grow and surpass all of the universities in other parts of the world, alumni began to decide that Brown too needed a mace. So we have our own version of this medieval implement representing knighthood and all of these ancient traditions. I think it was 1923 when a Mrs. George Sheffield said to Brown, "You need a mace," and so they made the mace. And if you could have looked at the mace, it has the names of all of the former chancellors and all of the former presidents, and it has all the former seals and everything else that has to do with the emblems and the symbols. So the mace itself is sort of like a complete archive engraved in gold and brass of the symbolic history of Brown. So in addition to that, in medieval universities and ancient mayoral rituals and so forth, important people were also given what were called chains of office. The chain of office is a symbolic piece of jewelry that gets put on in occasions, and each of the elements of the chain has symbols and various meaningful messages on it and so forth. So in 1964, President Riston decided that Brown, at that time it was anonymous, but then the secret came out that it was Riston that paid for it, decided that Brown too is rising into this world of distinguished and internationally recognized universities, and the president of Brown had to be dignified by a chain. So they found out who makes these medieval chains, and they made a beautiful one for the Brown president, which is worn first by Barnaby Keeney and then by every president since, but it's on loan back to the president for this weekend. And then a little bit farther along, Artemis Joukowsky, the former chancellor of Brown, noticed that chancellors and that the leaders of corporations also themselves in some institutions have chains of office, and so Brown needed to have one of these, and so he went to work and had one made, and it was first worn by Chancellor Richard Solomon in the 1980s. And so that's another piece of that's another implement that's out on loan back to the chancellor for the weekend, so we can't see that. So we have Alma Mater, then we have the mascots, the bears. Oh yeah, back to the bears. Brown inherited the Haffenreffer Museum in 1956. The Haffenreffer Museum was owned by the owner of the Narragansett Brewery in Rhode Island, which was one of Rhode Island's biggest industries at the time. And he was a collector of Native American artifacts and other historical curiosities and so forth. And when he gave it to Brown, in with this collection with this gigantic wood carving of a mama bear with a baby bear that you can see over in the corner. So for years, that bear sat down in the Brown Haffenreffer Museum. Well, not even on exhibit. I think it was largely in storage during all of that time. But in putting together this exhibit, we decided that, this bear too is a mascot. It belongs to Brown. Unlike the other mascots, and consistent now with the way in which Pembroke and Brown are merged, this is a mama bear. And so the little bear that we see trailing along behind the mama bear is, can you guess who? Legacy bear. Okay, you know what a legacy is. Okay, so that's Legacy Bear. Those are the primary symbols of Brown. Now, there's also the Manning chair, which is unfortunately also out on loan. But the Manning chair goes back to President Manning, the first president of Brown. It shows you how tradition has a life of its own. Somewhere along the way, this chair was given to Brown by Chancellor Stephen Hopkins. And it has since been discovered, it was thought that it was belonged by President Manning, and every Brown president has sat in that chair since Manning and so forth. And Harvard has such a chair, and most other places have special chairs where the president sits. And they all have amazing genealogies of who sat in them and so forth. But in fact, no one really knows where most of these chairs come from. The stories just have a life of their own. But this chair apparently came from a Spanish ship on its way to the Dominican Republic, or I guess the island of Hispaniola. It was made for the governor of the island of Hispaniola. It was picked off in the Atlantic by American privateers. It was brought to Newport, and it was given to Stephen Hopkins, who kept it in his family for a few years, and it ended up being Brown's chair, which is the one that we can't see today. But anyway, it's a very interesting object. So those, I think, are the primary symbols. Gates and entrances are very important. Once you begin to think in terms of a sacred space, a place where inside there's something really important and special that's happening, you demarcate that with architecture. And the way universities have demarcated that with architecture, again, primarily a early 20th century practice, is to build massive walls and gates. And on these gates, you put all of your symbols. So if you look at the Van Wickle Gate, you have the symbol of Providence, you have the symbol of Rhode Island, you have the symbol of Brown, you have owls, lamps of learning. Just about anything you can imagine is symbolized up there that has to do with the mission of the university. And this gate represents the entrance point, the symbolic entrance point. I mean, Brown now extends all the way out into the jewelry district, so it's no longer Brown's boundary, but it's Brown's symbolic boundary to this original 8 acres where the institution was originally built. So that's very important for graduation ceremonies and so forth. So what I want to say now is that the 4 primary rituals that Brown has and that you find in most places are convocation, and that's where the freshman class marches in, and in Brown's case, it's where the freshman class marches through the gate. They open the gates inward, and the freshman class marches in, and they've crossed that line from the world outside, the world of everyday life, the world of industry, the world of commerce, or whatever happens, the world of parents, all of that you leave behind. You go through this gate, and in this new world, something is going to happen to you that will separate you further from this life outside, but prepare you to go back into it as a much strengthened, more confident, more knowledgeable person. So convocation then is the first step of that. The president will greet, some faculty member will talk about some interesting topic of current interest and so forth, and the class of a whole is assembled and they, for the first time, sing the Alma Mater. That's the first singing of the Alma Mater. The other primary ritual is commencement, which is the reverse. That's where the class that marched in 4 years ago now marches out. They've been awarded their degree but down at the First Baptist Church prior to their exit through the Van Wickle Gate. So symbolically then they're leaving this sacred space and moving back out into the world, down the hill, and into everyday life where they'll now be spending the rest of their lives. But they return. If you look at the constitution of the commencement procession, you'll see that what leads it are the corporation of the president, and the administrators and so forth. And behind them are the faculty. And then behind them are the alumni classes. And so the oldest alumni class is the first. That's a very slow-moving class. So the president and so forth move very slowly as the procession goes along. And then it comes the more recent classes, the more recent classes, the more recent classes, until you finally get to those who are graduating that year. So the whole assembled Brown community, the faculty members, the parents, the graduates, everyone who has returned to the campus for their reunions, which were all out there at the campus dance last night, freezing. The entire Brown community for the duration of this procession is brought together in one place. And what's different and really interesting, I think it's unique about Brown's commencement, is that, and you'll see this tomorrow, as the president and her group exit through the Van Wickle Gate, the president and her group will divide into two sides, and they step aside. And then the next person who comes through, the next two or three people who come through, they then divide and they step aside. And what they create is a passage or a gauntlet through which all those who follow them will pass. And each in turn, as they follow them, that is the oldest alumni class, for example, they too take a position standing, so that as each other of the previous younger alumni classes and then the new graduates, the new PhDs, the new BAs, BAs, as they march through, those who form the gauntlet applaud, as do the parents and everyone else. And so once the whole procession has passed through, then the president again and her company and the trustees and the rest of it then reverse that, and they turn and they follow the gauntlet that they originally began, and they walk through until at the other end the president and the trustees and everyone else comes out, and they've gone back to the constitution of the order of the procession when it first started. So that during this time, every single member of the living Brown community, administration, faculty, students, the works, alumni, for this moment, or a few minutes, is there as a single face-to-face community, eye-to-eye community, applauding each other. So the whole place is brought together, meant to be a community. It's meant to be an endless procession. Universities, the thing that distinguishes university from almost any other institution is that they intend never to go out of business. And they don't. Universities are the oldest continuous institutions among the oldest continuous institutions in the world. Brown, for example, was here before the United States, and they'll probably be here for something else that follows the United States, who knows. But universities really see themselves as here out of time, in a sense. And out of time means that you're here eternally. And so just as this procession never ends, just as there are always new people coming in at one end and old people moving out at the other end, it never ends, and it continues on forever. So I think that, in a sense, you can say that this procession represents the eternal purpose of the university to continue its goals, its missions, its values, what it is that it represents, the contribution it makes to educating people and to improving the world and so forth. But at the same time, it brings together the community that is necessary to make this happen. Because tuition covers a lot, but what covers a lot also are those people who go out into the world and succeed at whatever they do and decide that you need a new gate, or you need a new building, or you need a new swimming pool, you need a new bear, or you need a new athletic facility, and so forth, and can make that happen. So it's a complex organization that reproduces itself through time, through these loyalties that are generated through the 4 years of partnership and community of living here, but also through the relationship to this eternal return of a procession. Okay, so those are two rituals. The third is inauguration, and that's when a new president's inaugurated, and that's also a big one. And the president doesn't become the president until they're presented with the chair, now with the president's chain of office, with the president's robe, and presented, the president has authority over the mace to determine who the mace carrier will be at rituals and so forth. But interestingly, the president is also given the charter. This charter now, which was signed by the King of England and everyone, this ancient document is now given custody. Custody of this document is given to the president, so it legitimizes the beginning. This is the symbol that she has now begun the duration of her office. Now, what's interesting about the Brown Charter is that I discovered, because I wanted to show it here, is that it's contained in a kind of a tin box that was meant to be protected from moths and worms and all the things that they must have had in the 18th century. So the charter had been kept in this box, and it, among all things, was the most sequestered of all sacred objects. So this charter, do you know where the old stone banquet building was down on North Main Street, South Main Street? Well, this charter was put in the vault of the old stone bank building down at the bottom of the hill by the edge of the river, which was the most secure place anywhere, within, I don't know how many miles of the campus. This is a place that nobody could ever, nothing could ever. So anyway, comes the hurricane of 1938, and the whole Narragansett Bay rose 10 feet. This huge wave came washing into the city, and so here's this, very, thief-proof facility in the basement of the first basement of the Old Stone Bank. And the charter, written on sheepskin in some kind of antique ink, the writing completely dissolved and washed out to sea when the hurricane withdrew and the water went back out to sea. The wording of the charter went with it, so that all that's in the tin box now is a Xerox of a copy that someone had made of the charter. And the charter itself is an old sheet that's not used, and it's still kept in a very secret place and all that, but it's no longer, I think, presented to the president. That document isn't, but rather the copy is presented. But I find that as interesting, that in many religious practices, the idea that if you put holy words into water, that is, you rinse off a text of the Bible or the Koran or whatever it happens to be, and then you keep that or you drink it or whatever, that the power of the text can somehow be imbibed. And so I like to think that the whole power of the Brown text has now become part of the 7 seas. It's all out there, having washed away. And anyway. And the fourth kind of ritual are the anniversaries. Every 50 years and 100 years, the university sort of looks back and tries to sort of like estimate, what has happened over that duration of time and since the beginning and over the last 50 years, as we're doing right now, and then try to think about the future. It's kind of like the summing up. It's a highly ritualized occasion that's observed with a great deal of forethought and planning and so forth, and it's the point where the books get written about the meaning of the place. It's the point where many, many kind of self-studies take place about what Brown has been doing that's really good and what Brown should be doing going forward. But and this involves another of separate rituals, and this is celebrated in different ways. But the way in which the 250th was initially celebrated last fall, as you may have noticed if you were here, was by a kind of, from an anthropological point of view, a ritual meal. They had a cake made of University Hall that was, I don't know, here's the procession, by the way, but a huge cake made of University Hall that had to be brought to the campus by a truck and carried by a whole team of people who were like pallbearers carrying this immense cake. And then as part of the president's presentation and so forth, they cut this cake up into little pieces, and everyone who was out there across the campus green then ate a piece of this cake, and that was the beginning of the celebration of the 250th. So kind of an absorption of the institution into oneself as part of that. But these festivals, these 50-year and 100-year festivals, they vary from one place to another. There's actually not exactly a formula for that, but they are nevertheless important. On the wall, you can see the Torchlight Procession. So take a peek at that if you have time. That was the 1914 150th, I guess it was. Must have been 150th. Yeah. And it shows the order of the procession. And just by looking at that, you can see how Brown has changed in those years. If you look at it, when you see Brown's procession tomorrow, you'll see the chancellor and so forth. And this procession here, marking the 150th, you have all of the Providence police. You have every possible military organization within driving distance or riding distance from Providence in their formations, all kinds of volunteer groups, militias, military outfits that don't even exist any longer. But anyway, and then following that were the categories of the usual categories of the faculty and so forth. And then following that were the undergraduates. And so the seniors, the juniors, and the sophomores dressed in military uniforms of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and those two wars. Some dressed as French sailors. One group, I think it was the juniors, dressed as French sailors. The front group dressed as some other revolutionary. And the freshman class, all white guys, no women, had war paint on with feathers, and they were the Narragansett Indians. So the attempt of this procession was to show the history of Rhode Island. They also had Roger Williams lookalikes and colonial governors and so forth. So the whole, and it marched from the Brown campus to Cathedral Square, which is over a mile away, way into the city. And thousands of people from the city came and watched this as the parade went by. They went by the city hall. They were applauded there and so forth. So I'm not sure what it tells you that's different. I mean, you can look at this in many different ways, how you want to interpret it. Nevertheless, I could not imagine now the freshman class of Brown would be celebrating the 250th anniversary by dressing as Narragansett Indians. Narragansett Indians would probably have some students in the class who would object to that, and so many, many things have changed. So, so I think other than that, most of these pieces here are relics of the either former ceremonies. We have some old films here of Brown ceremonies as they took place. And so I think that pretty well covers the ground. I may have missed something, but if any of you have any questions about any of this, I'd be happy to respond.